From terrifying abandoned insane asylums to the infamous Church of the Nine Ghosts, here are 10 seriously scary abandoned places. Number 10. Mysterious Dome Homes. These mysterious dome homes are located in perfect isolation on the southern tip of Marco Island in Florida. The story behind these weird homes, which are now slipping gradually into the sea, is a little strange. There are a lot of rumors surrounding the weird dome homes, which look like something you would find on an extraterrestrial planet, not in Florida. Some of the rumors claim the dome homes once belonged to a secret cult, while other people say they were left behind by aliens. While the latter is definitely doubtful, there's no mistaking that the domes are definitely being claimed by the sea. Each year they move closer and closer into the ocean. But who built this place, and why was it abandoned? So far as this real story goes, the place was built as a holiday home in 1980 by a retired oil producer who had been trying to fill his time with ambitious DIY projects. For the 80s, the houses were way ahead of their time. They were self-sustaining and solar-powered. Believe it or not, the domes were actually inhabited until 1993. But after that, the vacation homes were visited less and less. Storms came in and did some serious damage along the coastline, and the structures were eventually completely abandoned. Now, all that remains are some broken domes filled with water. You wouldn't even think people had ever lived in them. They're creepy and totally weird, especially now that they're nearly completely submerged in water. Number 9. The Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane. There's nothing scarier than an abandoned insane asylum. And so, let me introduce you to the Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane. What's interesting about this place is that it was never intended to be a house of horrors. We typically think about asylums as being dark, evil, and employing mass amounts of torture. But the building was actually not built with torture in mind. It was used in the early 19th century for those who had nobody to care for them and were incapable of caring for themselves. The Willard Asylum actually had Abraham Lincoln himself sign off on the proposal to house the despondent people inside the asylum. The Willard Asylum opened its doors in 1869. It had a women's side and a men's side, as well as a place for violent people and a place for non-violent people. The hospital even grew its own crops, which were tended by the patients. There was a bowling alley, a gymnasium, and even a movie theater. But it was still an insane asylum, and there were all kinds of horrifying treatments, like electroshock therapy and ice baths. The final patient was discharged in 1995, and the hospital shut down for good. A visit to the asylum now would yield nothing but horrors. While it's been closed for a long time and it's so decrepit and decaying, some of the remnants of the patients still live inside the building. It was cleared out in quite a hurry, and there are all kinds of horrifying artifacts still inside the rooms. It's definitely a scary place to go. There are currently no tourists allowed, and it's for good reason. You wouldn't want to be left alone at night inside the rotting shell of the asylum with all the voices of the crazy people haunting you at night. Have you ever gone around and investigated a mysterious or abandoned place? Perhaps a rusted old playground covered by growing vines, or a barn that hasn't held animals in decades. Was it scary? Let me know how it went in the comments below. Then, remember to subscribe if you haven't already. There are even more cool videos about to be released, and you'll want to subscribe to make sure you see them. Number 8. Montana's Ghost Town. Everyone loves a good ghost town. In Garnet, Montana, you'll find one of America's best preserved ghost towns. The town sits inside an isolated valley about 6,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by beautiful green pine forests. The outskirts may look pretty and relaxing, but Garnet has a distinctly haunted feeling to it, and for good reason. This town dates back to the turn of the 20th century. It was named after the Garnet rock mined in the area before gold was ever found. And yes, it was a mining town. And like most mining towns, Garnet was doomed to failure. At its peak, Garnet was making a cool fortune off the mining boom. It had 4 hotels, 4 stores, a butcher shop, a doctor's office, 2 barber shops, and 13 saloons. That should speak volumes about the people of the time. How did they even fit 13 saloons into such a small town? Where were the houses? Anyway, according to Legends of America, there were only ever a maximum of about 1,200 people in the town. 20 years after it was established, the gold ran out. Everyone left, and the town was widely abandoned by 1905. The town did experience a small boom in 1934 when some people moved back into the abandoned buildings. But then the First World War came, and Garnet was abandoned once more. Yet again, it was completely empty by 1940. Today, there are 30 buildings remaining on site, including a store and a saloon. There are a few mining cabins, and while you can rent a cabin in the ghost town and experience it for yourself, it's a pretty freaky place. You might not want to wander around at night, especially alone. Number 7. Atlanta Prison Farm. The Atlanta Prison Farm is a defunct prison that only operated between 1945 and 1995. This place has been rotting into the ground for the last 25 years. But it's a hugely popular adventure destination for urban explorers because it's so creepy. Nothing has been done with the building in so long that it's mostly decaying and being reclaimed by nature. There's graffiti all over the walls, and you know in the 50 years of the prison's operation there must have been a handful of deaths inside the walls and in the cells. It's basically impossible that horrendous things didn't happen there. Then in 2009, the roof of the prison caught fire, and rather than stop the fire, the firefighters just let it burn. Now the site is even more broken down than it used to be. It's actually a no trespassing area, and it's super dangerous to explore. Not only because it's spooky and there are probably ghosts, but also because there are cracks and holes in the floor that you could fall into and get severely injured. Please be careful out there. Number 6. Ararats Old Gaol. The only thing more disturbing than an old prison is an old prison that was transformed into a lunatic asylum and then eventually abandoned. This describes J Ward, formerly known as the Ararat County Gaol in Australia. This place is full of stories about murderers, ghosts, and tortures of the mentally ill. The bizarre former prison is about 2 hours from Melbourne and isn't all abandoned. While it's obviously not functioning, it does offer tours to curious visitors. But you better be brave if you're going to visit the old jail and lunatic asylum. What a horrible combination. The prison itself opened in 1859, but eventually the money for the place ran out in the 1880s, and the lunacy department took over the prison buildings. The county jail then became the housing ward for the criminally insane, where the most depraved and dangerous men in Australia were housed. And not only housed, but imprisoned in the most horrific conditions and under extremely high security. Remember, they didn't treat prisoners very well in the 19th century. Just trying to imagine what kind of horrible tortures went on inside the prison and lunatic asylum is enough to make me stay away from it. Number 5. The Black Church. With a name like the Black Church, you know it's going to be a scary place. The Black Church of Brasov is located in, of course, Brasov, which is in Transylvania and very near to Bran Castle, the famous inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula novel. The Black Church is one of the biggest Gothic cathedrals in Europe, and on a gloomy day in Brasov, it looks seriously intimidating, especially with its tall spires reaching for the black clouds and the gloomy mountains in the distance. The church was first erected in 1380 as a Catholic church, but because of a violent fire in 1689, the walls were left blackened by smoke, and even until today, the inside of the church is totally black. It makes for a very surreal experience when you walk into the church and see its dusty black walls. There aren't a lot of horror stories publicly known, but considering this was a church built in Transylvania during the 1300s, you can bet some pretty foul stuff went on either inside the church or outside of it. Remember, this was around the same time that Dracula was impaling people in Wallachia, and you can almost feel the misery seeping out of the brick when you visit the cathedral. The Black Church is able to accommodate about 5,000 people at once. It's also the largest sacred building in all of Romania, and in terms of all of Europe, it's probably the most important medieval place of worship. It's hard to find a more imposing Gothic church than this one. Number 4. Discovery Hut. Moving from the gloom of Transylvania, a strange abandoned building sits peacefully at the end of the earth. It's Discovery Hut at McMurdo Station in Antarctica. This tiny wooden hut is a remnant of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. It's abandoned, it's a little freaky, and it's not the kind of place I would want to hang out on my vacation. The Discovery Hut was built in 1902 at Hut Point on Ross Island. It was constructed by the British, who at the time were among the main nations with explorers sailing around the world trying to discover and claim everything. The British sent their best scientists down to Discovery Hut in an attempt to design a habitat suitable for Antarctic conditions. The hut was originally intended to be a base for more discovery expeditions. The unfortunate part of this was that even the brightest scientists in Britain weren't so bright, and the Antarctic habitat was a complete disaster. They actually prefabricated the hut in Australia and then transported it in pieces to be assembled on the spot. But obviously whoever designed it had never lived in the snow before. The insulation didn't work, the hut was unbearably cold, and the wind whistled through the walls. The crew actually refused to use it and just kept sleeping on their boat. But the design wasn't all bad considering Discovery Hut is still standing today. It just wasn't very good at the time, and it hasn't served a purpose since. You can still find some of the provisions left by that first expedition from the early 1900s at that hut. Because of the constant sub-zero temperatures, some of the items are actually in pretty good condition. For example, you can see some seal blubber hanging in the hut that's probably more than 100 years old. I wouldn't suggest eating it, but you can still see it hanging there. Number 3. Ross Island. Ross Island is a tiny island in the remote Andaman Archipelago, situated in the Bay of Bengal between India and Southeast Asia. There are approximately 572 tropical islands in the archipelago, with only about 38 of them inhabited. And while most of the islands are thriving with life and undisturbed forests, there's one horrible island with a dark past. This is Ross Island. It's a bizarre and captivating ghost town, where the remnants of an old British settlement from the 19th century are gradually being taken over by nature. As reported by the BBC, the British settlement was abandoned in the 1940s and has since been overcome by the jungle. Everything is being gradually destroyed, and that adds a whole extra layer of disturbance when visiting this place. For example, the cathedral with no ceiling being eaten by the vines and roots of the forest feels like a place where you could probably be eaten by cannibals. The history is a bit disturbing too. In 1857, the British Empire used Ross Island as a remote penal colony for Indian mutineers. The British actually arrived at the island with 200 Indian convicts and began to build the settlement. Of course, the inmates had to clear the jungle and build their own settlement, and the British officers got to stay on their boat and relax. The penal colony expanded and expanded. More prisoners were brought to the island, and giant mansions were built with manicured lawns, tennis courts, and the massive Presbyterian church that I previously mentioned. There was even a water purification plant and a military barracks. However, by 1942, the settlement was hardly livable. The British had been forced to release all their political prisoners in 1938. Then, the troops had to flee the island because of the imminent Japanese invasion. Eventually, nobody returned, and now you have what is almost certainly the creepiest ghost island in the world. Number 2. Krakow Ghost Town. There are so many great ghost towns. Let's move now to Italy, to the abandoned town of Krakow. The town was originally founded by the Greeks in 540 AD, and there have been tombs discovered in the town that date back to the 8th century. But unlike many abandoned towns, this one has a pretty enduring history. All the buildings were constructed basically on a hillside, and the population gradually grew from 450 all the way to 2,500 people by the 16th century. In fact, the town continued to expand on the hills until the 19th century, and that was when it reached its maximum load. There was a devastating landslide in 1963, and the remaining 1,800 residents still living on the hill were forced to leave their homes, and they could never return. The residents of the city were actually displaced and forced to live in tents while the government tried to find room for them. Now, the homes these people lived in for centuries are abandoned, creepy, and a tourist attraction. You can take a guided tour to see the sad remnants of the once thriving hill community. Number 1. The Church of the Nine Ghosts. The Church of the Nine Ghosts is located in the Czech Republic. And if you were to accidentally walk through the crumbling entrance and glance around in the shadowy church without knowing what was in store, you'd probably scream and have a heart attack. The church has sat abandoned since the 1960s, completely devoid of any human worshippers. But it's far from empty. There are ghosts lining many of the pews, with some hovering in the doorways and some in the aisles. The church first fell into disrepair during a funeral service in 1968 when the roof caved in. Locals took that as an obviously bad omen, and so they boarded up the church. It's pretty crazy considering this is a 14th century church and a historical landmark. But what can you do? Omens are omens. To keep the church alive, a local artist designed the ghosts and set them up inside the church. They're supposed to represent the Germans who lived in the town before World War II and would pray at the church every Sunday. The ghosts are made of plaster, and they were put in place during 2014 in hopes of drawing tourists to the region and rehabilitating the historical church. Which scary place would you like to visit the most? Tell me your thoughts in the comments, and thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you again for another fun video.